Beautiful, beautiful. So in your book, you touched on the emergence of Franco-German rabbinic influence in Spain, and you talked about it a little bit before, but I want you to go into it more. Can you explain the significance of it as it relates to the events and conditions that led to the Maimonidean controversy?
Yes. Again, very, 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 very important part of history that I think has not been really explored enough. We have to go back to the Gaonic time. So we know that after the death of Hay Gaon, essentially the power of the Jewish world went to Sepharad. We know at the end of Yevamot, it says that the Resh Galuta had gone to Cordoba, and Sefer HaKabbalah of Avraham ibn Daud, and there are many, many, many different source texts for this, that the yeshivot of Bavel went to Sepharad. You have to remember the cultures of Bavel and Muslim Spain were very similar. So we're talking about the transmission of a culture to another culture, which is very similar. So think of, for example, the Gaonim were the students of the Talmud. The Savoraim did some emendations, some edits, but then the Gaonim were the ones who essentially were the students of that. It wasn't even a text, but they were the students of that entity called the Talmud. Now, if you're transmitting things, ideas, texts, whatever it is, and you're moving from one country to another, right? Let's say I've got this oral tradition that I'm transmitting from Syria. It's much likelier for that transmission to be accurate and to be honored if it's being transmitted from Syria to Iraq. Why? Because the culture of Syria and Iraq is more similar, right? The language is the same, and we have the Gaonim, they wrote in Arabic. Obviously, Hachme Sefarad in Andalusia wrote Arabic, and the proximity was closer. The yeshivot had direct connection. So we have Robert Brody talks about this, Hachamim talk about this. So it's both on the academic and on the religious side. The connections between Bavel and Spain, southern Spain, the academies of Surah and Fumbedita, and then the academies of Cordoba and Lucena in Sefarad, those connections are based in historical fact. So that transmission was more accurate.
The Sefer Yuchsin talks about this, right?
Yes, exactly,
yep.
Exactly. There's many. There's I can just think of about 5 right now, and that transmission means that the Sephardim, this was essentially where they had the continuation of the Gaonic approach. Now, what happens here? You have southern Spain, then northern Spain. So all of everything that I'm talking about has been transmitted to southern Spain. Then in northern Spain, you've got the yeshivot of the Rashba, Ramban, and these Hachamim, great Hachamim, whose teachers were Ashkenazi. And we've got here, I actually had it that I wanted to make sure I mention over here. So if we see, for example, the traditions, because we always think of, the Ramban, the Rashba, giants, huge giants, we associate them, it's because they were in Spain. They're like the Andalusian Hachamim. But actually what we see here, for example, Ramban and Rashba, well, if we start with Rashba, he was a student of Yonah Garondi. Yonah Garondi was the foremost student of the Ashkenazi Shlomo ben Montpellier. Who was Shlomo ben Montpellier? Shlomo ben Montpellier was the leader of the movement, the Ashkenazi movement, against the southern Sephardi, as we know, Ramban. And then you've got Ramban. Ramban was a student of Yehuda ben Yakar and Azriel ben Menachem. Azriel ben Menachem was a student of Yitzchak the Blind. Yitzchak the Blind is where historical Kabbalah appeared. He was also a student of Natan ben Meir. All of these were Ashkenazi. So in a way, Ramban and Rashba, they were like the Sephardi rabbis that we have, but they might go to Lakewood or they may go to Meir, which is incredible yeshivot, unbelievable Mesorah that they have. But it wasn't the Mesorah that the Gaonim, the Sephardim transmitted from the Gaonic lands to the Sephardi lands. So what happens here? So you have these yeshivot in Sepharad, which are established and they grow and they thrive. And I mean, the Hachamim, people don't even talk about the Hachamim. They only talk about Harambam. Of course, who doesn't want to not talk about Harambam? But we're talking about Rav Moshe Bar Hanoch, Rav Shemuel Hanagid, the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Albela, Rav Yehuda Arbar Jaloni, Rav Eno Hushiel, Rav Yosef Ibn Megas, Rav Shlomo Ibn Gabirol, the Ibn Ezras, Ibn Jana, Ibn Hayuj, Rav Zachariah Agamati. I mean, the list goes on of all of these different Hachamim who were in these yeshivot of Sepharad, who continued that Gaonic approach. Now, the Franco-German Rhineland, and where the Ashkenazim were, that was very much developed after the Gaonic period. So you had about, according to the books of Sephardim Ashkenazim, about 3 to 10% at that time in the formative years of Sephardim Ashkenaz, about 3 to 10% of world Jewry were Ashkenazi. So the vast majority went to the southern Spain. You still had some in Israel, and only a few went to Ashkenaz. And then you had where the Ashkenazi approach developed. Now, what's very fascinating for me is that there's this discussion in the academic world, which is actually reflected in some of the religious works, in the religious world as well, as we see in Hacham Paul's writings, of where did this Ashkenazi approach come from, right? So Chaim Soloveitchik, unbelievable Hacham in many ways, he sees that the Surah from Bedita Yeshivot of Bavel, which is where the source of the Sephardi approach and the Sephardi Yeshivot was, they were so different from the Yeshivot of Ashkenaz, not just the way of learning, everything that was really there was very, very different, that he created this theory, Chaim Soloveitchik, of the unknown third yeshiva of Bavel. There must have been a third yeshiva in Bavel that this Mesorah came from. But actually what seems more realistic is that actually, no, there were certain customs and traditions that came from the yeshivot of Israel, so the Yerushalmi approach, and that's where we see a lot of the Ashkenazi Mesorah come from, the Yerushalmi approach, whereas the Sephardi approach comes more from the Babylonian. So it's not about, God forbid, one being real and one being not, it's just that it might be from two different places. So Robert Brody, a big academic, expert on the Gaonic culture, he's gone back and forth. There are fantastic essays you can find online, in many ways challenging, or if you want to be harsher, demolishing this theory of a third yeshiva of Bavel. Because we know about the yeshivot in Bavel. We know the funding routes, because these yeshivot couldn't stand on themselves. They were funded. Right. We know the teshuvot, the names, and all these different things, but there's no concept of any other yeshiva. So some have seen it as an attempt to clutch at straws and try to connect the Ashkenazi Mesorah to the Babylonian Mesorah. But I think that's very, very difficult to do that. I think many Ashkenazi Hachamim would hold the same. I think what's more likely is that you have a Yerushalmi tradition, and remember, the language was different. The Gaonim wrote a lot in Arabic. The culture was very, very different. The Ashkenazim, unfortunately, not as a result of their own decision, choice, were living in primitive Christian times, very, very primitive Christian times. So they were not enlightened in the way that the Sephardim were in Islamic Spain. Islamic Spain was very enlightened. All of the textbooks that you can imagine on philosophy and science that were written by the Greeks were translated into Arabic by the Muslims, which allowed our Hachamim to read these works. We always think of Harambam as being this big lover of Aristotle. Harambam never read Aristotle's works. He read translations of Aristotle's works. Yep. So in Ashkenaz, they didn't read Arabic. They didn't understand Arabic. So imagine your world of science and philosophy being shut out. Imagine we're in America and England, and all the works of philosophy and science are written in Japanese. What's going to happen to us? Obviously, we're not going to be exposed to it. So you had this culture, and then we see it shift. So as Christianity became more enlightened in Europe, the Ashkenazim became more enlightened. Yes. And as the Muslims became more primitive, if you like, and not as enlightened, they didn't study these things in the Middle East, that's where you get the famous, when the misconception, if you like, the Sephardim are backwards, which is not so misconceived. Or was saying as, the Sephardim of the Middle East, they didn't have the same enlightenment, if you like, as the Ashkenazim of the West. Why? Because we are a product of our society in many ways. It happened to be that our Hachamim of Sepharad were living in an enlightened Sephardi era in that medieval period, but then more recently we weren't. But that's one of the main distinctions, I think, that's dictated the difference between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim in their formative years.
And you said what percentage of Jews were Sephardic? You said
so at the formative years of the Ashkenazi Sephardi, because Ashkenazim never existed. It was post Babylonian, really, the idea even came to be. It's about 7 to 10% of world Jewry was Ashkenazi, which means that 93% to 90% were Sephardim.
That's crazy.
And by the way, this is continued. The trend continued only up until about 200 years ago. The vast majority of Jewish history has been Sephardi. It's only in the last 200 years that the Ashkenazim have been the majority, and that's why we live in very Ashkenormative times, where many things. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Ami magazine that came out recently.
No.
It had the front cover of Garami, or the chief rabbi of Iran, who's visiting New York, LA, he's doing a tour.
Yeah, we know
And
well.
the title of the thing was Yiddishkeit in Iran. Yiddishkeit in Iran.
Wow.
When they're trying to talk about Judaism in Iran, it's Yiddishkeit in Iran. Right? So that's how Ashkenormative things have become. We owe a lot of gratitude to the Ashkenazim, because I think a lot of the institutions that we have today, or a lot of the Jews that we have today, is the result of them being religious, thanks to the Ashkenazi institutions that were there.
Sure.
And it's very important for the Sephardim to know about their history, and very recent history, and the fact that the vast majority of Jewish history was Sephardi, and the ideological approach to Torah, very, very different to how it is
There's
today.
a lot of whitewashing of Sephardic history. Like, even people don't, like, someone who went to Ashkenazi yeshivas my whole life, he went to Ashkenazi yeshivas their whole life, we kind of felt a little bit like we were inferior in a way. We're always led to believe
Absolutely.
that.
Likewise, most of my friends had the same feeling. Absolutely.
But the fact
we had a minyan in the school, in Ashkenazi school here, the Sephardi minyan, and it was in a library, because obviously the main service was for the Ashkenazim, because there were more than us. So there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But then they would come in the middle of the library.
Right.
They would come in the middle of the library, in the middle of a shacharit. I would say, guys, we're doing shacharit. No, it's a Sephardi minyan. It's not a real minyan. So this doesn't represent all Ashkenazim. But there is definitely, without unapologetically, there has been very, 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 very much this Sephardi inferiority thing that's been pushed. You even see it in popular presentations in Shtisel in the latest season.
Of course.
Wants to marry a Sephardi. Are you mad? You want to marry a Sephardi? So this is not just something, remember, popular presentations very much represent popular situations. And I think that is definitely something symptomatic of this Sephardi inferiority.
So going back to what you were saying, how did these conditions lead to the Maimonidean controversy? Because you were mentioning that there was hostility growing.
Yes. So there's two. I would say the two Maimonidean, the two principles, or the two similarities that you see in the various Maimonidean controversies throughout time, and you still see it today. I don't think by any means have we stopped that controversy. Is one of them is an ideological one, and one of them is more of an educational / halachic one. So we'll start with the ideological one. We know the famous controversy between the Jews of the Spanish Jews, the Sephardim of southern France, and the Jews of northern Spain. So after the Andalusian expulsion in about 1147, the Sephardim went to southern France, also known as Languedoc. And there, the Ashkenazim were there, and you had this cultural conflict between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, because you had these enlightened Sephardim arrive with these, unfortunately, as a result of their community, and Christian community, primitive Ashkenazim. And there was this kind of a little bit of a clash, but the Sephardi way overtook. So you had this southern French region producing some of the most incredible works of Torah, philosophical, scientific, unbelievable, beautiful, beautiful works and ideas generated. But there was a bit of a clash. The northern Sephardi, or the northern Spaniard, Rashpa, wrote a ban, because he was, kind of egged on by Abamari, this person in Languedoc, about how the Sephardim have come and they've made it so philosophical. So the Rashpa writes a ban against the Jews of southern France who study philosophy, science, and all these different things. He says you're in cherem if you study them under the age of 25, which actually sounds very reasonable. Don't study these things till you're 25. The Hachamim of Sepharad in that region of Spain, in that region of southern France, wrote a cherem, a counter cherem, saying anyone who doesn't teach his kids these things, they will be put in a cherem. Now, why did this happen? Because it's the result of what I just described earlier. When you come from a cultural milieu where science and philosophy and all of these things are part of your understanding of Torah, this impacts your understanding of Torah. That's just how it is. And when it's the opposite, where it doesn't impact your study of Torah because all you had was the Talmud, and you commentated on the Talmud, and that's why you have much more Ashkenazi commentaries than you have Sephardi commentaries. There's certain theories of why they wouldn't study Mikra, but it was, they say that maybe it was because in the Ashkenazi world, in the Christian world that the Ashkenazim were living in, Mikra was the one thing that they shared in common with the Christians. But the one thing that differentiated them from the Christians, that allowed them to maintain their faith and not to have people go off the derech, was the Talmud. So that's why they would spend their time studying Talmud. Whereas the Sephardim, they were living in a Sephardi lands where the Mikra was tahrif, it was corrupted anyway, according to the Muslims. So they were able to start with Mikra, as we're supposed to, as it says in Avot and how the Sephardim have always studied. So what happened with that controversy? That controversy was a clash of ideology. We study everything to understand the world and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whereas no, we only study the Talmud. And that ideological conflict, which came as a result of the environments that the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim respectively lived in, came to a clash. Baruch Hashem, we had the Meiri, who came out and wrote with very respect towards the Rashba. It's a fantastic teshubah. One of our teachers, Daniel Kada of the Sephardi Bet Din, has a fantastic shiur on it on the Habura YouTube page. I recommend everyone to watch, where he goes through the teshubah of the Meiri after the Rashba ban. Rashba wrote another ban, everyone ignored it. The Meiri said, look, it's part of our culture. We study all of these things. The benefits of these things are much greater. They outweigh the concerns of going off the derech. So we have to study these things. So that's one thing, the ideological thing that really happened, the ideological controversies. Then there's the halachic or educational controversy. When the Mishneh Torah arrived, for the Ashkenazim, the Mishneh Torah was the last thing you need. Why? Because the majority of the learning is Gemara study, as we see today in most of the yeshivot, right? For the Sephardim, we had 3 levels of study. The first level is Mikra and the Sidur. And this goes back to the Gaonic time. So we have the Mekorot from the Gaonim saying how you need to delineate your Torah study. First is Mikra and Sidur. When you complete Mikra and Sidur, you're considered an Amharetz. The next level, and this is how strict it was. The next level is you know the Mikra, you know the Sidur, and then you know the Halachot. So this is the Halachot of the Rif or the Harambam. So basically the conclusions. That was the second level. Then you're a Talmid Hachamim. Harambam in the Mishneh Torah never says Talmid Hacham. He refers to Talmid Hachamim. So which is very interesting because you're a student of many Hachamim. So that's interesting. Third stage is once you've completed Mikra and the Sidur and then the Halachot, then you go through this thing called Talmud. Okay, which is not necessarily the Bavli, but it's the methodological process of how you connect the Pasak and how it goes all the way down. Connect the Pashat and the Derasha that was made all the way down to the conclusive Halakha that we have today. So that's a process. Talmud Torah is a process. It's not the Talmud is when even in Hachot Talmud Torah when it says the third level of study is Talmud, the Vilna edition says Gemara. That's wrong. That's based on a wrong Girsa. The Yad HaRambam says Talmud, and it was a process. So it's how to delineate and come to the conclusions. So when Ashkenazim many of the Ashkenazim went crazy with Harambam and the whole thing kicked off was because they thought that he's kicking off their whole educational curriculum. But for Harambam, no. The Mishneh Torah is stage 2. Gemara or Talmud study is stage 3. So the Mishneh Torah is there to help you with stage 2. It's not to replace stage 3. Stage 3, maybe 10%, 15% of the community we'd get to. The Sephardim, we even have much later Sephardim, like the Spanish and Portuguese. Their Mikra was top notch. We have it with our grandparents. They would recite Mikra like easy, like it was so simple to do it. That was where the controversy really kicked off as well. And Hacham Arusi gave a shiur recently to the Habura where he delineates this as well and explains that for them for the Ashkenazim it was very, very difficult because I wish I could go through the line. There's a particular line. I'll send it later. You should put it in the description of Harambam going back and forth with an Ashkenazi Hacham. But Ashkenazi Hacham said, you need to clarify that the Mishneh Torah is not here to replace the Gemara and not to replace Talmud study. And Harambam, in his beautiful poetic way, sometimes comes across as Harif. He said, I know your hidden agenda. I know what you're trying to do here. You haven't even given me the benefit of the doubt. He said, you don't know our educational system. So for you think it's replacing the Talmud, but this is level 2. Hacham Faror has a whole essay on how the Sephardim studied throughout history, and he has all of these quotes. I highly recommend you go to that thing. And that's where you see the 2 main Maimonidean controversies, and it's repeated throughout history. There's an ideological one, and then there's more of an educational / halachic one. And we see it today, even with the Habura. People say, why are you studying philosophy and logic? You're studying philosophy and logic? We're wasting your time. The Hachamim say, Rabbeinu Bachya beautifully says, those who don't study philosophy have contempt for the halakha, have contempt for law, because philosophy provides context. So
also the impact, I think the impact of having organized codified halakha for the first time in history, which the Rambam gave, is in a way threatening to the local rabbi who you have to go to him and he has to open the Gemara and he has to figure it out for you. Now anyone can just open up a book and figure out and find the answers. That probably plays a role into it. But what's interesting is a lot of people don't know this. Haramban, Nachmanides, was actually one of the staunch defenders of the Rambam during this controversy. And even in his disputation of Barcelona, he uses Maimonidean arguments, not Kabbalistic arguments, to defend, Judaism against Christianity. So he's a very enigmatic figure. I think there's a lot of people who don't really appreciate Haramban because he was somebody.
He's a giant.
Yeah, that's
giant. Absolutely. I mean, I've heard the two different approaches. Some say that he was, there was a distinction between the writings in public. I mean, the letter that he wrote, I think, to the French rabbis was a beautiful defense of Haramban.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, I think, a couple of quotes attributed to him where he chastises the Aristotelian who doesn't believe in demons. And some have connected that makor of him referring to Haramban, but I don't think there's really a way to prove either way. But regardless of that, I think the code of law point you make is very true. And I think that's the reason why having a Sanhedrin will be very, very difficult, but it will happen, please God, because the Sanhedrin removes caked on religion.
That's right.
On local authority. What are we going to do with the conveyor belt of Rabbanim if that happens? So it's double-edged sword. There's a benefit to have your own rabbi and you have your own community, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, we're a nation and we're not a religion, and we need to have a Sanhedrin, a Bet Din Hagadol, and that's why the study of Harambam's Mishneh Torah as an elementary level study of halakha is fundamental. Yeah. Because what you have are the maskanot of the last standing Bet Din Hagadol.
Of course,
it's a perfect place to start.
And it's also another, everyone else pretty much accepted the Shulchan Aruch at a certain point in history, and that's the only reason why that was even accepted, was because majority of it is based on Harambam.
90% of it is basically Mishneh Torah.
Yeah.
And even Maran says many times in the Teshuvot. There was one Teshuvah someone sent me the other day where someone asked him a she'elah saying, look, there's a Bet Din here that rules according only to Mishneh Torah. Yeah. This is in Maran's time, because remember, Maran was only accepted as authoritative and everyone 150 years after he died.
He also writes in his.
He was like, of course you follow Harambam. And in the introduction, I think it was to the Bet Yosef.
Yes.
Like, I'm going to come and tell you not to follow the Mishneh Torah.
Anybody who follows the communities that follow Harambam should continue to do so. I'm not here to replace them, right? A lot of people just don't.
Maran was unbelievable with it. I mean, people don't appreciate what Maran was trying to do. He was trying to take us out of that religious mindset and try to create that nation kind of understanding of law, which is everyone. Everyone just followed. I mean, people just think, oh, he just took majority opinion. The enterprise that he was trying to achieve is unbelievable. Unfortunately, it didn't work out fully. You had the Ramaz addendums and things like that, and then now we have obviously Ashkenazi Sephardi distinctions. But if the dream is that everyone would follow Shulchan Aruch. That's even controversial these days. Following Shulchan Aruch has its own issues these days, unfortunately. But once we can all do that, hopefully that will be the start of redemption.
Amen.